Alright, I'm going to split this video into three main parts. First of all, when this patch came out, I've actually been playing Squad, so I was excited to get into the firing range and test some of these new vehicles. So the first part is just going to show you some stats and what we found in testing in regards to the new content. The second part is going to talk about how I feel about it, because there is a very common theme with every single thing added to this patch, and that theme is just why? Where does it fit in? And we'll get to that in a second. And then third, we're going to talk about the 20 ticket radios, because that was the big meta change in this patch, and that is the thing that is actually worth talking about and is actually going to have a very big impact on games. And I'm sure it's the thing you want me to talk about, so I'll get to that in the end. Alright, first things first, the M113. Historical vehicle, everyone knows about it. It was only a matter of time before it came to Squad in some form or another. It was already in as an AA vehicle in the Heli mod, if I recall. But it's finally in the base game as a Canadian vehicle with a 50 caliber top, which of course all gave us quite the shock when they released it as a teaser and we all thought it was going to be the Marines, but you know. Anyway, moving on. This vehicle, we already knew what kind of weapon system it was going to have, and we already knew the armor was going to be shit and wasn't going to stand up to anything high caliber, but the big thing that we didn't know, and the thing that was going to make it or break it as an effective vehicle in Squad, was the HP. Now, if you know me, you know I have one massive pet peeve with the armor system in Squad and OWI's way of implementing vehicles, and that is the extremely bloated health pool with arbitrary rules assigned to it. Similar layouts of vehicles have wildly different HP, and there is no exception when it comes to tracked Vics like this. For example, take a look at these three vehicles here: the Scimitar, the MTLB, or the British Bulldog. Now, all three of these can be in some way compared to the M113. The Scimitar is light recon vehicle, fast, zippy, small tracked vehicle. It has a larger weapon and less troop capacity, but it can be compared. The MTLB has similar troop capacity, similarly has an HMG up top, and is probably the most similar, but you know, has a slightly different layout. It is also a tracked vehicle. And then you have the Bulldog, which once again, similar in that it can have a remote weapon system or an open top turret, a little bit bigger, a little bit better armored, whatever. These three vehicles have wildly different HP. Right? The Scimitar has 750, the MTLB has 1000, and the Bulldog has 2000. So that was what I was looking at really when they were introducing this. They were probably going to throw a dart in the dark and it was going to land on one of these values, and whichever one it was is going to have wildly different consequences for whether or not it was actually a capable vehicle. So what did they choose? 1000. Now what does this actually mean? Well, if you compare it to a Striker has 1250, and a Striker has a very similar time to kill against a BTR-82, which has 1000. The BTR-82 obviously has better damage output with the autocannon, but it's made up for by that extra 250 health. The 82 still wins, but it's burning by the end of the engagement. So, if they gave the M113 1250 like a Striker, which was something they theoretically could have done if they wanted it to be competitive, it would at the very least have equal time to kill against a comparable Russian APC. But they didn't. Similarly, the turret doesn't actually have stabilization, which is another downside, and then of course this thing is tracked, which in real life is great, and in Squad is basically a death sentence when fighting infantry and is a lack of mobility when moving cross-country. Ironically, I know, yes. Now, anyway, this thing cannot really be competitive as an APC against conventional factions. At best, it's comparable to an MTLB, because, you know, that 14.5 sucks, but that basically means you're only going against MEA with any chance of success, and even then the MEA vehicles have rocket pods, and MEA is honestly barely a conventional faction when it comes to their armor gameplay anyway, so let's be real here, this vehicle is basically useless as a conventional APC. Now the question is, how are they going to implement it then? My thought would be that they would just put it against irregulars on asymmetrical layers, but that was not my experience when I actually started playing and seeing a lot of the new Canadian layers. This thing does appear to be in some form or another on most maps going against conventionals. So honestly, I would consider this vehicle to basically be a nerf to the Canadian faction, since now when a developer is thinking about making a new layer, they might decide to give them one of these in lieu of a LAV-3, which is basically a Striker with 1250 HP and a 50 cal, or a LAV-6, which is even better with the Bushmaster and 1750 HP. So honestly, as I mentioned, I see this vehicle as a nerf to the Canadian faction, which makes me really look at the patch notes and wonder why they put in the sentence, this fills the gap for CAF in terms of a tracked troop transport, given that really that only exists for like 2 conventional factions and is basically useless as a concept in squad. A tracked troop transport, regardless of whether it's armored or logistics capable or what, is almost always going to be worse than a wheeled troop transport. Moving on, we have the G-Wagon, which is gangster as shit, but besides that, it is also bulletproof against small arms everywhere except the windows, which isn't really that big of an advantage. An armored techie is better at keeping its occupants alive, and has some kind of open-top turret, or a transport variant, or, interestingly, a logistics variant. The closest compared vehicle to this would once again be the MEA with the Samir, which also has small logistics capabilities or similar functions. And honestly, it is once again something that most regular factions do not have. I could have seen this being introduced as a stopgap for the TAP V, but the Canadians already have a light Vic, an MRAP equivalent. So honestly, once again, I don't really see why this was introduced. To give you more stats, you can see how much it carries here in terms of build supply, so you can use this to create a single FOB. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's bulletproof everywhere except the windows. Once again, this vehicle is an oddity, and I'm curious to see how it is introduced on conventional layers, and whether it is once again essentially a nerf by convincing people to, or convincing squad devs to put this on a layer in lieu of a TAP V, which would have been a superior option. Now obviously the logistics one is different, but as of yet, I have not seen that on any layer. I imagine it would be something that is only added against irregulars because an extra logistics vehicle is just too big of a buff for most conventional factions. It's a really big buff for MEA, and I love the Samir. If there's a logistics variation of it on a layer that already has 3 Logi trucks, that is a huge buff for a conventional faction. But as of yet, I have not seen that on any CAF layers, and I don't want to because I don't think CAF needs a buff like that. That's just too much. Another oddity that was added is the Canadian version of the Mi-17, which, I mean, why? I don't know. It's one thing if they just put it on Afghan layers like they said they were going to against irregulars, but I have seen this thing on Goro against Americans, so I don't know. I can't really get behind this. It just looks to me like a reskinned piece of content being put out there because the patch notes were already a little bit light in a way that is pretty meaningless and doesn't really do anything other than confuse people on the ground. If you're a pilot and you want to fly this thing, I wish you the best of luck not getting team killed. Now, the first thing that's actually exciting, the Hell Cannon. I don't want to knock on this too much because I can't get too good of an idea of it until I actually see it more in action in a game. I did play a layer of Sumari as the first game I got into after I was done testing, and the guy who ran the Hell Cannon on Sumari Invasion was the person with the most kills in the game. So it obviously can be effective against densely packed infantry, but obviously Sumari is a unique layer, and the real question is it any better than mortars? And honestly, I don't really think so. Obviously, it has a bigger range. You can see me getting hit by it here, and obviously it's going to be pretty good against structures or whatever, but it is much lower rate of fire, and it costs a lot more ammo. I can't really see any situation where I would want the increased blast range for wounding infantry, but wouldn't just want the increased rate of fire of mortars. As you've heard me say before, mortars are something I primarily use for destroying structures because that is the best way to get a lot of value out of them, and I don't really see why I would use a Hell Cannon instead of mortars. You can place one Hell Cannon on a FOB in addition to your mortars, but it's also going to make it a higher priority target, especially right now when everybody's, focused on it because it's the new piece of content. So I don't really know how practical it's going to be. But one thing that we discovered that is really fun is you can use it as essentially a howitzer, as seen here. So that is basically all of the new content that I wanted to take a look at, and as I said, there's a real common theme between all of it, which is just why? Why add a tracked transport that isn't competitive as an armored fighting vehicle to the Canadian faction? They add all sorts of outdated vehicles like these, or interesting one-off vehicles, or vehicles that aren't competitive within the squad meta, like the LAVs with open-top turrets, or 7.62, or stuff like that. They do this all of the time, and I think what they're envisioning is these cool convoys going against irregulars and having this wide variety of vehicles where they each have to cover each other's weakness. But in reality, it just makes it significantly harder for OWI to balance conventional layers with conventionals against conventionals, which is what I prefer to play. And in the end of the day, I get annoyed when I see very easy schemes that OWI used to use for balancing layers, like 1 MBT, 1 IFE, 2 APCs, 2 light VIX, 3 Logis, 1 transport, that kind of generic loadout that they would give conventionals that would fight another conventional with a similar generic loadout. I see them moving away from this and adding all these weird, spicy, outdated vehicles and giving Russians BTR 80s and scout cars, even though they now have, Tigers, which I understand those are a little bit different and they do have different capabilities, but still, they add all of these weird, unique vehicles with interesting capabilities that aren't quite competitive in the traditional sense against the other factions' weird, unique vehicles, and I'm sure some people like that, but for me, it really just serves to annoy me. If I'm going to run armor on a layer, I want to have a very clear, distinct squad name that tells everybody exactly what I intend to claim, and I want to claim all of the vehicles of that type. I want to run APCs or IFEs or tanks. And when your APCs have 282s and then 180, or have 2 M113s and then a LAV 3 with a 762 RWS, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. It just doesn't really help the team for me to take those vehicles. It's weird if I ignore them, and they just feel like useless content. Similarly, the G-Wagon, that's just too powerful if you throw a Logi on, but if you start replacing tap Vs with open top 50s that don't protect the crew, what are you doing? What does this vehicle serve? If they just add it as addition and give them a unique, somewhat armored transport in addition to their transport truck, then yeah, it's a buff. But then why do other vehicles not, or other factions not have similar vehicles? The US could have an unarmed Humvee, the Russians could have one of those old Gaz things, I don't know, they already have a bunch of Soviet shit. Point is, it would be cool if all the factions got this as a simple utility vehicle that could be used to get around for individuals like combat NGs or hat kits that wasn't necessarily tied to full troop transport, but I don't see why they should just give one to the Canadians if it's not part of an effort to unify that vehicle type for most factions. As I said, in the patch notes, they already said for the APC, if I can find it here again, this fills the gap for CAF in terms of a tracked troop transport, meaning they already view each vehicle category as something that they should try to fill with something in most factions, but in the same breath, they also added what is essentially a new vehicle category for a conventional faction, if you don't include the Samir for the MEA, which feels a bit like a stopgap for their lack of light Vic. And of course, there's also the argument to be made that this steps on the toes of the insurgents and the irregulars, who were already one of the most mobile factions purely because of their ability to have trucks with various form of armament that move quickly. And then the Hell Cannon, once again, it's a new form of indirect fire, but the functionality just doesn't feel all that different from the existing form of indirect fire. So, is it just there for variety and immersion? Probably. Is that a good thing to have in the game? Yeah, I guess. And in this case, it doesn't matter as much because it's not like vehicle claims where it's something teams might fight over. But I still just feel the question, why? But enough of the negativity, let's get on to the good change. 20-ticket radios. If you know me, you know that anything that slows down the production of radios as a viable strategy is good in my book. And having more value attached to the radio is a good thing in my opinion. It's not necessarily the best way, in my opinion, to address FOB spam, but it is a way to address it, and it might have some effect. Now, there are upsides and downsides to this. The downsides being that this is addressing a symptom. The reason why people spam FOBs is because it is the best way to attain map control and to move infantry. Spawn shifting is significantly better than transportation, and the only way to have a tangible effect in a region for an extended period of time is to have the ability for quick respawns to be there, because that is the predominant way to get more and more manpower advantage over your enemy. You cannot sit there and KD and revive your way through 3 blueberry squads constantly mashing that respawn button. Now, of course, that has a ticket cost, and it is good that they are increasing the ticket cost further by adding new risk to the radio, or I guess I should say old risk since it's been back and forth between 20 and 10. But in the end of the day, if there is a newish to intermediate squad leader who has no concept of his ticket impact on a game, this does absolutely nothing to change his decision-making process. It can cause him to lose the game, but he's not going to know why, and he's not going to change his behavior. The good news is FOB spam is something that is predominantly done by more experienced players who recognize ticket values, and this is going to weigh on their minds. I, for one, am going to be factoring this in when I build FOBs from now on, so it is going to have a effect on the more experienced crowd. But in the end of the day, this is just another example of something that can represent a huge ticket sink that your average person has absolutely no concept of because of poor communication or training from OWI. Now, moving on to how it affects my gameplay and the things I teach. As you guys know, a lot of people always ask me, is there a limitation to FOB spam? It's one of the most frequent questions I get. I spend all of my guides and all my videos promoting it and explaining all of the benefits, and then people want to know, when doesn't it work? And there are plenty of answers to that. If you watch comp games, you're not going to see a lot of FOB spam because having more FOBs means you have more tickets laying around for competent players who can put two and two together and recognize where players are coming from to flank and destroy. It spreads your forces thin if you actually want to defend the radios, and defending radios is actually somewhat common in comp because everybody is that much more experienced, and an undefended radio is going to be found and destroyed fairly quickly. The same can't usually be said for pub games. Even if you're pretty blatantly obvious with where you're coming from, it's not too frequent for somebody to make a smart, immediate, fast flank on the origin of your spawns, and then make a smart, educated push on your radio without giving themselves away. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It happens. I'm just saying it's not something that you can constantly, consistently rely on happening like you could if you joined a comp game. Similarly, sometimes my strategies do not result in a captured flag. You guys know that I always say bleed as many tickets as you need to in your initial attempt to get that flag. I will place 2 or 3 attack radios before it's even established itself, just because I want to get multiple directions in. I want to place something to the east of the flag. I want contact to start pushing that. I want that to develop into a firefight that could go anyway. It could work with us actually overriding them and getting to the flag. It could work with them pushing us back and actually starting to dig our radio. Whatever happens there, it doesn't matter because I'm getting that second radio to the west and getting that concentrated, effective push in there. And now, regardless of what happens, we're either going to assist with proxying the centralized FOB because both flanks are now pushing it, or we're going to push into that flag relatively uncontested because the entire enemy team is now pushed off, taking down our radio because of that somewhat vigorous fight. Point is, I will build multiple habs, I will do multiple attempts, I will run trucks into dangerous situations, I will encourage people to grind, give up, respawn, and maintain a distraction, and I will hemorrhage tickets trying to get an objective, because the objective is worth more tickets than what I am going to use on my attack, most likely, especially if I am able to take that objective and wipe everybody on it and get their radio or 2 radios. Now, obviously, 20 ticket radios make that window a little bit more narrow. There's now more times when I'm going to more quickly consider maybe this isn't working and we need to go defensive. Of course, as I have mentioned, this is far from something that's going to be in the mind of your average pub player when they are either FOB spamming or just building a single FOB. Whatever their strategy is, they don't give a shit that it's 10 or 20 tickets, let's be real. So, in your average pub game, is this going to make a difference? Maybe, probably not. In your average higher level pub game, yeah, it will. Is it enough to convince people to stop spamming FOBs everywhere? Maybe in offensive or defensive scenarios, but definitely not in flag changes. You're still going to want to spam, rush, give up, build a FOB, and just work your hardest to getting to the next exposed flag as quickly as possible after a flag change, whether it's a new offense objective or defense objective. The value there is just unmatched by anything. It doesn't matter if the radios cost 50 tickets. And similarly, you're going to find yourself in just as much of a bind if you build too few FOBs and as a result have less map control and start gradually losing objectives, as you would if you built too many FOBs and allowed 1 or 2 to die as canaries, but in exchange held that objective worth 50 to 70 tickets. So as is tradition with all these recent updates, there is a small meta change that is a baby step in the correct direction. That has been the case for over a year now, and it's good to see that they are addressing issues, but it is always going to leave a lot to be desired, to be honest, when they are this few and this far between.